Before I tell you what happened in my own living room on a Sunday afternoon in October, I want you to sit with one question. What would you do if the people who were supposed to protect you spent years silently working to destroy you, and the only thing standing between them and everything they wanted was a signature they never bothered to read? Stay with me to the end, because the answer to that question is the reason I am still standing in that house today, and they are not. If stories like this speak to you, hit subscribe now because you will not want to miss what comes next. And if this opening already has your stomach in knots, drop a like before we go any further. Now let's begin. My name is Isla Ashworth, and for 11 years I believed that silence was the price of peace. I want to tell you how wrong I was, but first I need to take you back to the afternoon. My mother-in-law walked into my house with a stranger on her arm and introduced her to my husband as his future wife, while I was standing 3 feet away holding a serving dish of roasted vegetables I had made for what I thought was a simple family lunch. Isla Ashworth had never liked me. That much I had understood since the week Julian proposed, when she sat across from me at a restaurant table and asked, in front of the whole family, what exactly I brought to this marriage besides my name. I had laughed it off then, the way you laugh off things you are not yet ready to fight. 11 years later, I was no longer laughing, but I still hadn't learned to fight either, and that Sunday I paid for it. I remember, too, the engagement dinner itself, weeks after that first pointed question, when Corrine gave a toast that praised Julian's patience for finding love in an unlikely place, as though I were a stray he had generously taken in rather than a woman he had chosen, wholeheartedly, out of every option available to him. I remember smiling through that toast in a room full of people, because that was what was expected of me, and because Julian squeezed my hand under the table in a way that felt, at the time, like enough of an apology. It never occurred to me in those early years to ask myself what it would cost me to keep accepting apologies delivered through a squeeze of the hand instead of words spoken plainly, in front of the people doing the harm. I loved Julian. I loved the life we were building. And I told myself over and over that his mother's coldness was simply a hurdle to outlast, not a warning to take seriously. The woman's name was Simone. She was younger than me by at least a decade, sharply dressed, poised in the particular way of someone who has been coached on exactly what to say. Corrine held her by the elbow like a prize she was presenting, and when Julian's father Desmond cleared his throat and said, "Isla, dear, we thought it was time you met Simone properly," I understood, in the space of that single sentence, that this had all been planned before I ever set the table. I looked at my husband. Julian did not meet my eyes. He busied himself pouring wine into glasses that did not need pouring, and in that small, cowardly motion, I learned more about the last 11 years of my marriage than I had in all the years that came before it. He had known. He had sat in this house, eaten meals I cooked, slept beside me every night, and said nothing about the fact that his own mother was auditioning my replacement at our dinner table. Corrine didn't stop there. She sat Simone down in my chair, the one at the head of the table nearest the kitchen, the one I had occupied for over a decade, and she began to talk, brightly and deliberately, about how well Simone understood the responsibilities of being married into this family. She talked about Simone's family standing, her education, her understanding of, as Corrine put it, what a Ashworth wife is required to manage. Every word was a blade dressed up as small talk, and every blade was aimed at me. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only a few seconds. The dish I was holding suddenly became heavier than it had been a moment earlier. I could smell the rosemary I had used on the vegetables, could feel the warmth of the ceramic through the kitchen towel wrapped around my hands, and I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that I had chosen this exact dish because it was one of Julian's favorites. I had spent the morning making it with the kind of care you only put into food for people you love, and that none of that care meant anything to the people currently seated around the table I had set. Simone, to her credit, looked uncomfortable in a way that showed she hadn't fully understood the role she'd been cast into until she was already sitting in it. She glanced at me once, briefly, something that might have been apology flickering across her face before Corrine redirected her attention back to the conversation. I would think about that glance often in the months that followed, wondering whether Simone, too, had simply been a piece moved into position by people more powerful than her, without ever being given the full picture of what she was agreeing to. I set the serving dish down without a word. I want you to understand that my silence in that moment was not weakness. It was calculation, though I would not have called it that at the time. Something in me, some old and patient part of myself, understood that if I opened my mouth right then, I would say something I could not take back, and I was not ready to burn the house down before I understood exactly what I was standing on. Bridget, Julian's sister, watched the whole scene with the faint, satisfied smile of someone enjoying a show she had already seen the ending of. She caught my eye once, and instead of looking away in shame, she raised her glass slightly, as if toasting my humiliation. I would remember that gesture for a long time. I would have use for it later. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask in 11 years of dismissing me as the quiet wife who kept the house and made the dinners, was that I had spent those same 11 years building something they assumed belonged to my husband. Larkspur Design Studio, the design firm that had grown from a single rented studio into a company with 3 offices and a client list that included some of the wealthiest families in the state, was not Julian's company. It had never been Julian's company. It was mine, built with my name on the founding papers, my signature on every early loan, my sleepless nights turning a business plan into a real, breathing thing, while Julian worked a job he eventually left to become, on paper only, my co-owner. They believed the company belonged to him because that was the story that was convenient for them to believe. Men built things. Wives supported men. That was the shape of the world Isla Ashworth had constructed in her head, and no fact I could have offered her in that moment would have shaken it loose. So I offered her nothing. I smiled, thin and correct, and I asked if anyone wanted coffee. That night after Simone had been driven home by Desmond, after Corrine had kissed her son's cheek and told him within my hearing that she was proud of him for finally considering his future seriously, after the house had emptied of everyone but the 2 of us, I asked Julian one question. I asked him how long this had been planned. He told me it wasn't what I thought. He told me his mother had simply wanted him to meet someone from a good family, a professional courtesy, nothing more. He told me I was overreacting to a lunch. I looked at my husband of 11 years, a man I had built a life and a home and a business alongside, and I understood that he expected me to accept this explanation the way I had accepted every smaller humiliation before it, quietly, gratefully, without consequence. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry, though I wanted to. I simply asked him one more question. I asked him whether he understood what would happen to Larkspur if he ever tried to leave this marriage the way his mother clearly hoped he would. He blinked at me, confused, because in 11 years, I had never once discussed the legal architecture of our shared life with him in a tone that carried a warning. He said, "Of course, it's ours. We'd split it evenly. That's how these things work." I asked him gently whether he had ever actually read the documents that governed how these things worked in our specific case. He said he trusted me, that he'd never needed to read them because he knew I would never try to shortchange him. I remember looking at him in that moment and feeling something complicated settle over me, a mixture of tenderness for the trust he was offering me and quiet alarm at how easily that same trust had been weaponized by his own family, who had built an entire plan on the assumption that his casual confidence reflected legal reality rather than simple hope. "I'm not trying to shortchange anyone," I told him. "I just think it might be worth understanding what we actually signed, given everything that happened today." He nodded, distracted, already moving toward the stairs, already treating the conversation as resolved. I let him go. I had learned by then that some conversations are more useful left open than closed, especially when the person on the other side of them doesn't yet understand what's actually at stake. I let him believe that. For now. Because the truth that not one person in that family had bothered to learn in over a decade, was going to matter a great deal more than any of them understood, and I intended to choose exactly the right moment to make sure they learned it. That night, I sat alone in the office at the back of the house, the one where I kept the files nobody else had ever asked to see, and I opened a drawer I hadn't opened in years. Inside was a folder with the original incorporation documents for Larkspur Design Studio, my name listed as sole founder, and a prenuptial agreement Julian had signed without complaint 11 years ago because, at the time, neither of us had anything worth protecting. Both of us had been so young. Neither of us could have imagined what the company would become, or what his family would eventually try to take from me. I ran my fingers over the old signatures, mine steady and deliberate, his rushed and slanted, the signature of a man signing something he trusted completely and had no intention of ever revisiting. I remembered that afternoon clearly, the small conference room, the paper cups of bad coffee, Julian joking that he hoped I wasn't planning on leaving him for someone with more money, and both of us laughing because the idea seemed impossible at the time. We had nothing to protect from each other then. We had only each other, and a business the size of a spare bedroom. I thought about how much had changed since that afternoon, and how little either of us had bothered to revisit the paperwork as everything around it grew. It is a strange thing, building a life with someone. You assume the foundation holds simply because you laid it once together in good faith. You do not think to check it again until the walls above it are already shaking. I closed the folder and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to Julian move around upstairs, running water, brushing his teeth, going through the small, ordinary motions of a man who believed the evening's conversation had already resolved itself. He had no idea that I was sitting 2 floors below him, holding the exact document that would determine everything his family had spent who knew how long quietly planning around. They thought I had lost everything. They had walked into my home and celebrated a future in which I simply did not exist. But they had made their plans without once checking who actually owned the ground they were standing on, and that mistake was about to cost them more than any of them could imagine. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because I promise you, what happens next will feel like justice. To understand why Isla Ashworth's plan was doomed before she ever brought Simone through my front door, you need to understand who I was before I became Julian's wife, because the woman they thought they were dealing with, the quiet, agreeable, replaceable wife, was never the whole truth of me. She was simply the version of myself I had learned to perform in that family's presence, because performing had always been easier than fighting. I met Julian when I was 26, working 2 jobs while I tried to save enough money to turn a hobby into something real. I had always loved design, the way a room could be reshaped entirely by the right choice of light and space, and I had spent years sketching floor plans in notebooks nobody else ever saw. Julian was kind in those early days, or at least he seemed kind, attentive in the way men are when they are still trying to win you rather than keep you. He told me my ambition was beautiful. He told me he wanted to help me build it. What he actually did was watch. For the first 2 years of our relationship, Julian worked a stable but unremarkable job at a logistics company, and I worked myself past exhaustion turning my design sketches into an actual business. I took out a small loan against my own name, because I had no family money behind me, and Julian's family made it clear from the beginning that they were not interested in underwriting the ambitions of a woman they considered beneath their son. I remember the exact words Desmond Ashworth used at an early dinner. He said, "It's sweet that she has a hobby." I turned that hobby into Larkspur Design Studio within 3 years, though turned makes the process sound cleaner than it actually was. There were entire months where I wasn't certain the business would survive. I remember a stretch in the second year when we lost our 2 largest clients within the same quarter, when I sat at my kitchen table doing math that refused to work out, wondering whether I had made a catastrophic mistake walking away from the stability of a salaried job to chase something as fragile as a design studio with my name on the lease. I didn't tell Julian how close we came to failing that year. I told him in general terms that things were tight, but I never let him see the actual numbers, never let him understand how many nights I lay awake recalculating whether I could make payroll for my 2 employees before I paid myself anything at all. I think, looking back, that this was the first small brick in a pattern that would eventually cost me. I had already learned, even before I married into the Ashworth family, to carry the heaviest truths alone, to present a calm, capable surface to the people around me, while the real weight stayed hidden where no one else had to help me carry it. I signed the incorporation papers alone, because at the time Julian and I were not yet married, and there was no reason for his name to appear anywhere on the founding documents of a business he had contributed nothing to beyond encouragement. When we did marry 2 years later, I made what I now recognize as one deliberate, protective decision, buried inside what looked, to everyone around us, like an act of trust. I asked Julian to sign a prenuptial agreement, not because I distrusted him in that moment, but because I had already watched his mother's face when she looked at me, and some instinct in me understood that the day might come when the Ashworth family decided I was disposable. Julian signed it without reading more than the summary page, because at the time, Larkspur was small enough that neither of us thought its ownership structure mattered. The agreement stated plainly that any business founded prior to the marriage, along with all its future growth, remained the sole property of its founder. That founder was me. Over the next several years, Larkspur grew far beyond what either of us had imagined. I hired our first employee, then our fifth, then our 20th. I secured contracts with clients whose homes appeared in magazines. I remember the first time a client recognized my name from a design publication before I had even introduced myself. That small moment felt like proof I had built something real, something that existed independently of anyone's permission or approval. Julian eventually left his logistics job to work alongside me, and I gave him a title, Director of Operations, because I loved him, and because it felt right to share the day-to-day work of the company we now both showed up to every morning. He was genuinely good at parts of the job, particularly the client-facing logistics, scheduling, and vendor relationships that freed me up to focus on design work and long-term strategy. I want to be fair to him here, because this story is not about pretending Julian contributed nothing. He contributed real, valuable labor for years. What he never contributed and never asked to formalize was ownership. But a title on a business card is not the same as ownership on a legal document, and Julian never once asked to have his name added to the incorporation papers, because he never once imagined he would need to. I think, if I am honest, some part of him assumed that marriage itself functioned as an informal merger, that whatever belonged to me automatically became ours. The moment we said our vows, regardless of what any piece of paper actually said. It is a comfortable assumption to hold, right up until the day someone with a very different agenda decides to test it. Corrine, meanwhile, told her friends her son had built a design empire. She told them this at every luncheon, every charity gala, every family gathering, because it was a story that flattered her far more than the truth, which was that her son had married a woman with no family money and no name worth mentioning, and that woman had built something real with her own hands, while the Ashworth family looked down on her the entire time. I let her believe it. I let all of them believe it, because correcting them would have required a kind of confrontation I was not yet ready to have, and because, if I am honest with you now, some small, tired part of me had started to believe that keeping the peace was worth more than being seen clearly. I told myself I was protecting my marriage. What I was actually doing was slowly disappearing inside it. There were warning signs I chose not to examine too closely. The way Corrine would call the house and ask to speak to Julian about business matters that were, in fact, my business's matters. The way Desmond would introduce Julian at social events as the owner of Larkspur Design Studio while I stood beside him, unnamed, as though I were staff hired for the evening. The way Bridget would ask me, at every family dinner, when I planned to step back and let Julian run things properly, as though the company I had built from nothing was a role I was merely borrowing until a more legitimate owner arrived to claim it. I remember one particular dinner, maybe 5 years into the marriage, when a family friend asked me directly what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Corrine cut in and said, brightly, "Isla helps Julian with his little design company." Helps. As though I were an assistant who had wandered into the role rather than the woman whose name was on every early loan document, whose sketches had become the blueprint for a company now employing dozens of people. I remember opening my mouth to correct her, and then closing it again, because I had learned by then that correcting Corrine in public cost more than it was worth. She would smile through the correction and then punish you for it quietly, later, in ways that were harder to name and therefore harder to fight. I told myself for years that this was simply what it meant to marry into an old family with old expectations. I told myself that Julian loved me, that his love was the thing that mattered, and that his family's opinion of my role in our shared life was a separate, lesser concern I did not need to spend my energy defending against. I built an entire philosophy of endurance around that belief, and for a long time, it worked well enough to let me sleep at night. What I did not understand, what I refused to let myself understand, was that endurance without correction is simply surrender stretched out over a longer timeline. Every dinner where I let Corine's version of events stand uncorrected was a brick laid in the foundation of the story she would eventually use against me. By the time she brought Simone to my table, she was not improvising. She was executing a plan built on years of my own silence, silence I had mistaken for far too long for peace. I told myself these were small cruelties, survivable ones, the kind every woman married into a family like this has to absorb. I did not yet understand that they were reconnaissance. Every question about ownership, every comment about stepping back, every casual mention of Julian's business was Isla Ashworth quietly mapping the terrain of a war she had already decided to fight, long before she ever brought Simone to my table. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters. Have you ever realized, long after the fact, that the people closest to you were preparing for your departure while you were still trying to build a home with them? If that question lands anywhere close to your own life, stay with me, because what I discovered next was the moment everything Corrine thought she knew about my situation began to fall apart, piece by piece, without her ever seeing it coming. Looking back now, I can trace the campaign against me with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside it. It began roughly 2 years before that Sunday lunch, though I didn't recognize it as a beginning at the time. Corrine started inviting Julian to lunch alone, without me, telling me it was mother-son time that she'd been missing. I believed her, because believing her was easier than wondering what she actually discussed with my husband over those meals. I found out much later, from Bridget of all people, in a moment of careless honesty she likely regretted, that those lunches had a recurring theme. Corrine wanted to know how serious my involvement in Larkspur really was. She wanted to know whether Julian had ever considered what would happen to the business if the marriage ever ended. She framed these questions as concern for her son's financial future. But what she was really doing was gathering intelligence, trying to determine whether her son had accidentally built his fortune on a foundation he didn't legally own. Julian, to his credit or perhaps to his shame, apparently told her the truth as he understood it. He told her Larkspur was ours, that everything we had built belonged to both of us equally, because that was the story he had told himself for years, the comfortable story that let him walk into rooms as a business owner without ever having read the paperwork that said otherwise. Corrine believed him, because it was the story she needed to be true. It was around this time that Simone entered the family's orbit. I later learned she was the daughter of a business associate of Desmond's, a woman with her own inherited wealth, and more importantly to Corrine, a family name that would elevate the Ashworths socially in a way that marrying me never had. Corrine began cultivating a friendship with Simone's mother, inviting the family to dinners I was, for the first time in years, not informed about until after they had already happened. To be honest, there were nights during this period when I sensed something was wrong, like when Julian would come home distracted after one of his mother's lunches, or when he would look at me with an expression I couldn't quite name, something between guilt and calculation. I asked him once directly if everything was all right between him and his mother. He told me she was just stressed about Desmond's health. I believed him because I wanted to, and because the alternative, that my husband was slowly being walked toward the idea of replacing me, was too large a thing to hold. The campaign accelerated after Desmond suffered a minor heart scare that spring. It wasn't serious, but it gave Corrine exactly the kind of urgency she needed. Suddenly, there were family meetings about the future, about what would happen to the Ashworth name and legacy if something happened to Desmond, about the importance of Julian securing his position, his family, his assets. I was invited to none of these meetings, though I lived in the house where several of them apparently took place while I was at the office. I began noticing Corrine's growing closeness with Simone's mother at social functions I hadn't previously paid much attention to. They would sit together at charity events, heads bent in conversation that stopped, conspicuously, whenever I approached. At one gala, I watched Corrine introduce Simone's mother to several of her oldest friends, as though the two families were already connected by something more than passing acquaintance. And I remember the small, cold feeling that settled in my stomach as I registered how deliberate the introduction sounded, how rehearsed. I asked Julian about it once casually over dinner, whether his mother had grown close with a new family. He told me he wasn't sure who I meant, and I believed him, because I didn't yet have a name to attach to the unease I was feeling, only a pattern of behavior that didn't add up to anything I could point to directly. It would be months before I learned the name Simone, and by then, the friendship between the two families had already deepened far beyond casual gala conversation. It was Bridget who finally let something slip, months later, in a moment of pure carelessness after too much wine at a birthday dinner. She told me, with the casual cruelty of someone who has never had to fight for anything in her life, that the family had been preparing options in case Julian's marriage didn't work out, because, as she put it, everyone could see it wasn't built to last. I asked her what she meant by options. She laughed and said I'd find out eventually, and changed the subject before I could press further. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake replaying every strange absence, every closed-door conversation, every moment Corrine had looked at me across a room with something that wasn't quite contempt but was close enough to leave a mark. And for the first time in 11 years, I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong and started asking myself what they were planning, and what exactly they thought they stood to gain from it. I began, quietly, to pay attention in a way I never had before. I noticed that Corrine had started referring to Larkspur in casual conversation, with a proprietary tone she had never used in the earlier years of our marriage, back when the company was still small enough that nobody in that family thought it worth claiming. I noticed that Desmond had begun asking Julian pointed questions about the business's long-term structure, at family gatherings, questions dressed up as fatherly concern but sharpened, I realized in hindsight, with a very specific curiosity about ownership and succession. I noticed, too, that the family had started treating me with a strange, performative kindness in public, the kind of kindness people extend to someone they've already decided doesn't matter anymore, a kindness that costs nothing because it isn't real. Corrine would compliment my outfit at dinner, ask hollow questions about my week, and then turn immediately to Julian to discuss matters that concerned my own company as though I weren't sitting 3 feet away with a far more complete understanding of those matters than anyone else at the table. I did not yet have proof of a coordinated plan. What I had was a mounting collection of small, specific wrongnesses the kind that don't add up to anything provable on their own but together form an unmistakable shape once you finally step back far enough to see them. I started keeping a mental ledger. The lunches, the pointed questions, the performative kindness, the strange new proprietary tone in Kareen's voice whenever she mentioned my company, each one small, together undeniable. The answer, I would come to understand, was everything. Isla Ashworth had built an entire second version of my marriage in her head, one where her son was the sole architect of Larkspur Design Studio, where I was a helpful but replaceable presence, where a more suitable wife could simply be introduced and installed without any legal complication, because in her mind, there was nothing legally binding me to the wealth she assumed her son controlled. She was so confident in this fiction that she never once thought to verify it. Not with a lawyer, not with an accountant, not even with a simple conversation with me, the person who actually held the answer to every question she had spent 2 years quietly trying to solve. She had built her entire plan on an assumption, and assumptions, I have learned, are the most fragile foundation anyone can build a war on. I remember calling my closest friend from those years, a woman named Odette who had known me since before Larkspur existed, before Julian, before any of it. I told her about the strange lunches, the pointed questions, the performative kindness that felt more like theater than warmth. Odette listened, and then asked me a question that stayed with me for a long time afterward. She asked whether I had ever told Kareen, plainly and without softening, exactly what Larkspur was worth, and exactly whose name was on the paperwork. I admitted I hadn't. Odette asked why not, and I found I didn't have a good answer beyond the vague sense that doing so would have felt like bragging, or worse, like starting a fight I wasn't sure I was prepared to finish. Odette told me something I didn't want to hear at the time but never forgot. She said, "Isla, you keep waiting for people to notice what you've built on their own. Some people will never notice unless you make them look directly at it. Kareen is one of those people." I didn't act on her advice immediately. It would take Simone sitting in my chair to finally make me understand exactly how right Odette had been. By the time Simone sat down in my chair that Sunday afternoon, Kareen believed she had already won. She believed the hardest part, softening Julian toward the idea, introducing the replacement gently, was behind her. She believed that whatever came next, a quiet divorce, a discreet settlement, a graceful exit for me, would unfold on terms she and her lawyers would dictate, because she believed, wrongly, catastrophically, that there was nothing of real value that belonged to me alone. If you've made it this far, I want you to sit with this feeling for just a moment, because it's the same feeling I carried for weeks after that lunch. The particular, cold clarity of understanding that people you loved had been planning your erasure while you were still setting the table for them. Comment below if you've ever felt that same realization settle over you, and stay close, because the moment I decided to stop absorbing their cruelty and start using the truth as a weapon is coming next, and it changes everything. The Monday after that lunch, I did not go to Julian with accusations. I did not confront Kareen. I did something far more useful. I called my attorney, a sharp, quietly formidable woman named Adaline Whitmore who had drafted our prenuptial agreement over a decade earlier and had, in the years since, become someone I trusted with more than just contracts. I told Adaline everything. The lunch, Simone, Kareen's years of quiet campaigning, Bridget's careless comment about options. Adaline listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished, she asked me a single question that reframed the entire situation in my mind. She asked, "Isla, does Julian actually know what he signed 11 years ago?" I told her I wasn't certain. I explained that we'd signed several documents over the years related to the business's growth, tax restructuring, investment rounds, and that I honestly couldn't recall the precise language of every clause without going back through the files myself. Adaline told me that was completely normal, that most people don't memorize the fine print of documents signed a decade earlier, especially not during periods of rapid business growth, when there are 100 more urgent things demanding your attention. Adaline pulled the original documents while we spoke, and together we walked through them line by line, the way we should have done together years earlier, if either of us had imagined we would ever need to. The prenuptial agreement was airtight. Larkspur Design Studio, along with all assets, expansions, subsidiary holdings, and intellectual property developed under its name during the marriage, remained my sole property, protected explicitly from any claim Julian or his family could make in the event of divorce. But Adaline found something else, something I had genuinely forgotten in the chaos of building a company while also building a marriage. Buried in an amendment, we had signed nearly 6 years into the marriage, when Larkspur secured a major investment round and restructured its ownership for tax purposes. There was a clause neither Julian nor I had paid much attention to at the time. It stated that Julian's operational role entitled him to a modest profit-sharing arrangement, a salary tied to performance, but explicitly not to any equity or ownership stake in the company itself. He had signed this amendment, too, on a rushed afternoon between client meetings, trusting me completely, never once asking his own lawyer to review it. In other words, Julian had spent 11 years believing and telling his family that he co-owned a company that legally belonged to me and me alone. He was not lying to them. He was lying to himself first, and they had built their entire plan on top of his mistaken belief. Adaline asked me the question that would define everything that came after. She asked me what I wanted to do with this information. I sat with that question for a long time before I answered, because the truth is, in that moment, I did not yet know if I wanted to save my marriage or end it. What I did know, with total clarity, was that I was no longer willing to let anyone in that family believe they held power over me that they did not actually possess. "You don't have to decide today," Adaline told me, closing the folder gently as though she understood that the paper inside it was heavier than its weight suggested. "But I want you to understand something. Right now, you're the only person in this situation who actually knows the truth. Julian doesn't know it. His mother doesn't know it. That's not a small advantage, Isla. That's the entire game." I asked her what she meant. She leaned back in her chair and said something I would return to many times over the following weeks. People who believe they already understand a situation stop asking questions about it. Corrine thinks she knows exactly what she's dealing with. As long as that's true, she's going to keep making decisions based on a version of reality that doesn't actually exist. You get to decide when and how she finds out how wrong she is. That's not manipulation. That's just patience. I thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. Patience had cost me a great deal over the last 11 years. For the first time, I began to understand that the same patience, aimed with intention instead of simply endured, could become something else entirely. I asked Adaline to quietly prepare 2 things. First, a complete audit of Larkspur's ownership structure, updated and unambiguous, ready to be produced the moment I needed it. Second, a review of what would happen, legally and financially, if Julian chose to pursue a divorce, so that I understood exactly where I stood before anyone else in that family made a move they thought would corner me. While Adaline worked, I began paying closer attention to my own home. I noticed things I had trained myself not to notice before. Documents left open on Julian's laptop when he stepped away, real estate listings for properties Simon's family owned, emails between Corrine and a family lawyer I didn't recognize, subject lines referencing transition planning and asset protection for Julian. I did not confront him about any of it. I photographed what I could, quietly, and sent it to Adaline, because I understood now that I was not simply protecting my marriage anymore. I was gathering evidence for a war I had not started but fully intended to win. There was one evening during this period that I still think about often. I came home earlier than expected from a client meeting and found Julian on a call in his study, the door slightly ajar, his voice low in a way that made me pause in the hallway before announcing myself. He was talking to his mother, and I heard him say, clearly, I don't think Isla would ever agree to that, followed by a long pause and then quieter. I know, Mom, but she's still my wife. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, torn between relief that some part of him was still resisting his mother's plans, and a colder recognition that he was resisting them quietly, privately, without ever once telling me what exactly he was resisting on my behalf. I didn't confront him about the call. I simply filed it away, another piece of the pattern I was assembling, evidence that Julian existed somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground between loyalty to me and a lifetime of deference to his mother's expectations. I wondered, not for the first time, which side would eventually win if the pressure grew heavy enough. Julian, for his part, seemed to sense a shift in me without understanding its source. He became more attentive in the weeks after that lunch, bringing home flowers, suggesting date nights, telling me Simone had simply been his mother's idea and meant nothing to him. I let him believe his small gestures were working. I smiled at the flowers. I went to the dinners. I gave him no reason to suspect that every kindness he offered me now was being weighed against a truth he did not yet know I possessed. It was during this period that I finally understood something about my own silence that reframed the entire shape of my marriage. My silence had never protected me. It had simply given the people around me room to believe whatever story was most convenient for them. And Isla Ashworth, in particular, had used that room generously, building an entire fantasy of my irrelevance on the empty space where my voice should have been. I decided, sitting in Adaline's office on a rainy Thursday afternoon, that I was done providing that room, not through confrontation, not yet, but through the same careful, patient construction Corrine had used against me for 2 years. If she wanted to build a plan on an assumption, I was going to let her keep building, right up until the moment the entire structure collapsed under the weight of a truth she never bothered to check. There was a strange, almost peaceful clarity in making that decision. For years, I had treated my own silence as a burden, something I endured because I lacked a better option. Now, for the first time, I understood that silence could also be a tool, deployed deliberately rather than defaulted into out of fear. The difference mattered more than I could have explained to anyone who hadn't lived it. One silence shrinks you, the other simply waits. While Adaline worked through the audit, I found myself returning, almost obsessively, to the early years of the company, pulling old files, old contracts, old emails, as though I needed to physically hold the evidence of my own history in order to believe it was real. I found the original loan application I had submitted at 28, the loan officer's skeptical questions about whether a woman with no prior business experience could realistically service the debt, my own handwritten projections, wildly optimistic in places, conservative in others, all of it eventually proven right by a decade of actual results. I found photographs from the first studio, a cramped, single room above a hardware store, paint samples taped to the walls, a single drafting table I had bought second-hand and refinished myself because I couldn't afford a new one. I remember Julian visiting that studio exactly twice in the first year, both times briefly, both times more interested in whether I'd be home in time for dinner than in what I was actually building. It wasn't cruelty on his part, not back then. It was simply indifference, the quiet indifference of someone who assumed my ambition was a phase rather than a foundation. Adaline finished the audit 3 weeks later. It confirmed everything the original documents had suggested. Larkspur Design Studio, valued that year at just over $11 million across its 3 locations, its client contracts, and its growing licensing arm, belonged entirely, unambiguously, and legally to me. Julian's name appeared nowhere on a single ownership document. If our marriage ended tomorrow, he would walk away with his personal savings, his car, and nothing else, because there was nothing else that had ever belonged to him. I sat with that number for a long time. $11 million, built from a rented studio, and a folder of sketches nobody in that family had ever bothered to look at twice. and they had spent 2 years quietly planning to take it from me, without once discovering that there was, in fact, nothing to take, because it had never belonged to the man they assumed owned it. If you've ever discovered that the ground beneath someone else's confidence was actually yours all along, you understand exactly what I felt in that office. Tell me where you're watching from right now, because what happens when Isla Ashworth finally makes her move, thinking she holds every card, is coming up next, and I promise you, it is worth the wait. It was Bridget who delivered the news, though I don't think she understood at the time that she was handing me exactly the confirmation I needed. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice bright with the particular cruelty of someone who believes she is being generous by warning you of your own downfall. She told me that Julian would be filing for divorce within the month. She told me the family's lawyers had already begun preparing the paperwork. She told me, almost as an afterthought, that everyone agreed it would be cleaner for Julian to retain the business, since he had built it up so much over the years. I asked her, calmly, who had told her this. She said her mother had explained the whole plan at dinner the previous night, a dinner I had not been invited to, in my own extended family, discussing the dissolution of my marriage and the seizure of my company, as though both were foregone conclusions, requiring nothing more than paperwork and patience. "Are you even upset?" Bridget asked at one point during that call, apparently thrown by how calmly I was receiving news that should have devastated me. I told her I was processing it. She seemed satisfied with that answer, mistaking my composure for shock rather than what it actually was, which was quiet, contained certainty about exactly how this story was going to end. She went on almost gleefully to describe how Corinne had already begun discussing next steps with Simone's mother, floating language like, "when the transition is finalized," as though the entire situation were a corporate merger rather than the dissolution of a marriage. She told me Corinne had even mentioned, casually, hosting an engagement dinner for Julian and Simone sometime in the spring. Once everything settles, I let her talk. Every detail she offered, freely, carelessly, was another piece of evidence Adaline would later use to demonstrate exactly how confident, and exactly how wrong, this family had been. I thanked Bridget for the call. I meant it, in a way she would never understand. She had just confirmed, in a single careless phone call, that the family's entire plan rested on the same false assumption Adaline and I had already dismantled weeks earlier. They believed Larkspur belonged to Julian. They were preparing to fight a war over territory that had never been theirs to claim. 2 days later, Julian came to me. He looked exhausted, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been talked into a decision he doesn't fully believe in but lacks the courage to refuse. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where his mother had once seated Simone in my chair, and for a long moment he simply stared at his hands before he finally spoke. He told me, in halting, rehearsed language that I recognized instantly as his mother's phrasing dressed up in his own voice, that he thought it might be healthiest for both of us to consider a separation. He talked about growing apart. He talked about wanting different things, about feeling like the last few years had pulled us into different versions of ourselves. It was, I recognized immediately, a script one Corinne had almost certainly helped him rehearse, full of soft, blameless language designed to make an ending feel mutual rather than engineered. He did not once mention Simone's name, though I noticed he also did not deny it when I asked him directly whether his family's plans for his future included her. He looked away instead, which was, in its own way, an answer clearer than any words could have provided. I asked him whether any part of this decision was actually his, or whether he was simply delivering a message his mother had written for him. He didn't answer that question either, and his silence told me everything I needed to know about how far his family's influence had reached into a decision that was supposed to belong to the two of us alone. He admitted it, quietly, almost apologetically, as though the apology made the betrayal smaller. He told me his mother believed Simone would be a better fit for where the family was heading. He told me Desmond had already begun discussing a business partnership between Simon's family holdings and Larkspur, a partnership he described as though it were a foregone conclusion, as though my company were simply a piece of property to be reassigned to whichever wife occupied the house next. I asked him one question. I asked him whether he had ever, in 11 years, actually read the ownership documents for the company he was preparing to fight me for. He hesitated. He said he assumed it didn't matter, since we'd built everything together. I told him it mattered a great deal, and that he should ask his lawyer before this went any further to request a formal copy of Larkspur's incorporation records and ownership structure. I watched something flicker across his face, the first real doubt I had seen in weeks. He asked me quietly whether I was angry with him. I told him I wasn't angry yet, because anger required certainty, and I was still gathering it. He didn't understand what I meant, and I didn't explain further, because some truths are more useful held close than spoken aloud before their moment arrives. He told me, in that same conversation, something I suspect he regretted admitting almost as soon as he said it. He told me his mother had already spoken to Simon's family about a potential business arrangement, something involving Simon's family's capital and Larkspur's design reputation, a partnership Corrine described as securing the family's future properly this time. I asked him what this time was supposed to mean, given that Larkspur had never once been insecure under my ownership. He didn't have an answer. I don't think it had ever occurred to him to ask the question himself. Within days, I received formal notice that Julian, through a lawyer his mother had selected and was quietly paying for, intended to file for divorce, and that his legal team would be requesting what the paperwork vaguely described as an equitable division of marital business assets. I gave the notice to Adaline without comment. She read it twice, then looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as controlled delight. "They have no idea what they've just started," she said. And she was right, though it would take a formal legal response to make Julian, and eventually his entire family, understand exactly how wrong their confidence had been. Corrine, in the meantime, began behaving as though victory were already secured. She invited Simone to a family dinner I was, for the first time, formally excluded from, hosted at Desmond and Corrine's own home, where sources later told me Corrine openly discussed Simone's role going forward, as though the transition were already underway. She began referring to Larkspur, in conversations with her friends, as the business Julian is finally taking full control of, language that would later prove remarkably useful when Adaline compiled a record of the family's public statements as evidence of their assumptions and intentions. I heard, secondhand, that Corrine had begun telling her friends the divorce was already essentially finalized, that Julian would soon be free to start over properly, language that made my skin crawl when it was repeated back to me by a mutual acquaintance who clearly had no idea how much damage she was doing simply by relaying gossip at a book club. Corrine had grown so confident in her fiction that she was no longer even bothering to keep it private, no longer treating it as a plan in motion, but as a settled fact already worth celebrating socially. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because I think it's the hardest lesson this entire experience taught me. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from believing you hold all the power in a situation, and that confidence makes people careless. Isla Ashworth was so certain of her victory that she stopped bothering to verify anything. She told her friends, her family, her lawyer, anyone who would listen, that her son owned a multi-million-dollar design firm, without once asking to see the paperwork that would have told her, in plain, unambiguous language, that he did not. That carelessness was about to cost her everything she believed she was about to gain. Adaline filed a formal response to Julian's legal team within the week, including the original prenuptial agreement, the amendment confirming Julian's lack of equity, and a complete notarized ownership audit confirming that Larkspur Design Studio, in its entirety, belonged solely to me. The response was polite, precise, and utterly devastating to a plan built on nothing but assumption. If you've ever watched someone celebrate a victory they hadn't actually won yet, you know the particular satisfaction of what came next. What happens when Julian's family finally opens that response is worth waiting for. The moment they understand exactly what they'd been planning to take from a woman they never once bothered to actually see. Stick around, and please subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. I wasn't in the room when Julian's lawyer delivered the news to him, but Adaline was on the receiving end of the panicked phone call that followed less than an hour later, and she relayed the details to me with the kind of professional calm that barely masked her own satisfaction. Julian's lawyer had reviewed the documents Adaline provided, cross-checked them against public incorporation records, and confirmed in writing that Larkspur Design Studio had never, at any point, included Julian Ashworth as an owner, partner, or equity holder of any kind. Julian called me that evening. His voice was different than I had heard it in years, stripped of the rehearsed calm his mother had clearly coached into him. He asked me, almost pleading, whether it was true. I told him the truth was something he could have learned at any point in the last 11 years, simply by asking to see the paperwork he was now discovering for the first time through a lawyer's letter. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked what would happen now. I told him that decision belonged to both of us, but that it would happen on terms grounded in reality this time, not in the fiction his mother had constructed. I told him I was willing to discuss the future of our marriage honestly, but that I would no longer participate in a process built on the assumption that I had nothing of my own to protect. Corinne did not take the news quietly. Bridget told me later that her mother's first reaction, upon learning the truth from Julian, was not shock at her own miscalculation, but fury directed entirely at me, as though I had somehow deceived the family by simply owning what I had legally always owned. She accused me, through Julian, of hiding the company's ownership from the family for years, as though transparency about my own legal property had ever been an obligation I owed to people who had spent 2 years quietly plotting my replacement. Desmond, apparently, took the news differently. Bridget described her father sitting in silence at the kitchen table for nearly an hour after reading the lawyer's letter, saying almost nothing, before finally asking Corinne a single question that Bridget said seemed to genuinely unsettle her. How many other assumptions had the family built this entire plan on without ever bothering to verify them? Corinne reportedly had no answer, only a fresh wave of anger directed, once again, not at her own carelessness but at me, for the crime of having quietly, legally, undeniably owned what she had spent 2 years assuming belonged to someone else. I let a full week pass before requesting the final family meeting. I wanted the shock to settle into something closer to reality first, wanted Corinne to sit with the discomfort of her own miscalculation, before I gave her an audience to perform indignation in front of. Adaline warned me again that I owed this family nothing further, that the legal matter was effectively settled, and further engagement carried only risk. I told her I understood, but that I needed, for my own sake as much as anyone else's, to say certain things out loud in the room where they had first been unsaid. I asked Julian to arrange one final family meeting, not out of cruelty, though I understand if it sounds that way, but because I believed, after everything, that the truth deserved to be spoken in the same room where the lie had first been constructed. Adaline advised against it. She told me I had already won everything that mattered in a legal sense, and that further confrontation carried risk without reward. I told her I understood the risk, but that some things could not be resolved through paperwork alone. Some things needed to be said out loud, to the faces of the people who had underestimated me. The meeting took place 2 weeks later in the same house, at the same table, where Corinne had once sat Simone in my chair and narrated my replacement as though I were simply an item being returned to a shelf. This time, I sat at the head of the table myself. I had chosen my seat deliberately that morning, arriving early to set the table exactly as I wanted it. No serving dish in my hands this time. Nothing to occupy my grip except my own steady certainty. Karine arrived precisely on time, dressed as though for a business negotiation, Desmond beside her looking older and more tired than I remembered him being just weeks earlier. Bridget trailed behind them, uncharacteristically quiet, her earlier confidence visibly diminished since our last conversation. Julian sat beside me, not at the opposite end of the table where his mother might have expected him, a small positioning choice that I noticed Karine register with a flicker of surprise before she composed herself. Karine arrived expecting, I believe, some kind of negotiation, some opportunity to salvage the arrangement her family had spent 2 years constructing. She opened the conversation herself, before I had said a single word, launching into a prepared statement about wanting to clear the air and move forward as a family. Language so transparently rehearsed that I nearly felt sorry for her, standing at the edge of a cliff she did not yet know she had already walked off. What she got instead was a single folder, placed calmly in the center of the table, containing everything Adaline had compiled. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because I think the loudest moments of my life have never actually required volume. I told Karine plainly that Larkspur Design Studio had been built by my hands alone, incorporated under my name alone, protected under a prenuptial agreement her own son had signed without reading, an agreement that made every plan she had spent 2 years constructing entirely, catastrophically irrelevant. I watched her face change as she opened the folder herself and read the ownership documents in silence. I watched Desmond lean over to read them alongside her, his expression shifting from confidence to something closer to disbelief. I watched Bridget, who had once raised a glass to toast my humiliation, go pale as she realized the options she had once bragged about had never existed at all. Karine tried, briefly, to argue that the family's contributions, introductions to clients, social connections, Julian's years of operational work, entitled them to some claim on the business regardless of what the paperwork said. Adaline, who had accompanied me to the meeting, calmly explained that none of those contributions carried any legal weight against a properly executed and unchallenged prenuptial agreement, and that any attempt to pursue such a claim in court would be not only unsuccessful but costly, given the strength of the documentation already on record. Desmond was the first to speak after several long minutes of silence. He asked Adaline, in a voice that had lost all its earlier bluster, whether there was any possibility the documents could be contested. Adaline explained, patiently and without a trace of triumph in her tone, that the prenuptial agreement had been executed with full independent legal counsel on both sides, that the amendment 6 years later had been properly notarized, and that any attempt to challenge either document in court would fail, likely at considerable expense to whoever chose to pursue it. Karine closed the folder slowly. For a moment I thought she might apologize, and some small, tired part of me almost hoped she would. Instead, she looked at me and asked, in a voice tight with barely controlled anger, why I had never told the family the truth about the company's ownership. I told her the truth had never been a secret. It was simply information she had never once asked for, because asking would have required treating me as someone whose answers mattered. I told Karine one more thing before the meeting ended, something I had rehearsed in my head for weeks but had never expected to actually say out loud. I told her that I understood now why she had never once asked to see the ownership papers in 11 years. I told her it was because she had never actually believed I was capable of building something that mattered. She had looked at me from the very first dinner and decided I was simply the woman her son happened to marry, not the woman who would go on to build an empire while the family who dismissed her watched from a comfortable distance, never once bothering to check what was actually theirs to claim. The meeting ended not with shouting, not with the dramatic confrontation I had once imagined in my angrier moments, but with a quiet, heavy silence that felt, in its own way, more final than any argument could have been. Corrine gathered her coat. Desmond thanked me quietly for the coffee, as though the strangeness of the moment had briefly returned him to simple manners. Bridget lingered a moment longer than the others, glancing at me before she left, an expression on her face I hadn't seen from her before, something that might have been the beginning of respect. I sat alone at that table for a long time after they left, Julian beside me, neither of us speaking. I felt no triumph in that silence, only a tired, settled clarity, the particular exhaustion that comes after finally putting down a weight you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. If you've ever sat across from someone who spent years underestimating you and watched the exact moment they finally understood how wrong they were, you know there's no feeling quite like it. Comment below if this moment hit you the way it hit me, because what happened after that meeting, the choice I made about my marriage, and the price the Ashworth family ultimately paid for their arrogance, is coming next, and it is not what any of them expected. In the weeks that followed that meeting, I had to make a decision that had nothing to do with ownership documents or legal leverage. I had to decide what I actually wanted to do with my marriage, now that the fiction Corrine had built around it had collapsed entirely. Winning the legal argument had never been the same thing as deciding whether I still wanted to be Julian's wife, and I want to be honest with you about how complicated that question actually was. Julian, to his credit, did not try to salvage the marriage by leaning on his family's approval anymore. In fact, something shifted in him after that meeting, a kind of clarity he had been avoiding for years. He told me, in a conversation late one night that felt more honest than anything we had said to each other in a long time, that he had spent his entire adult life letting his mother define what success and stability looked like, and that somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing me as his partner and started seeing me as an extension of a life his family approved of. He apologized, not the rehearsed, defensive apology he had offered after the lunch with Simone, but something quieter and more difficult, an acknowledgement that he had allowed his family to plan around the assumption that I was replaceable, and that he had never once stood up to correct them, even when some part of him must have known it was wrong. I told him the truth, which was that an apology, however sincere, could not undo 2 years of watching him let his family plot around my erasure without saying a word in my defense. I told him that trust, once broken this thoroughly, does not simply reassemble itself because the danger has passed. He asked me if there was any path back for us. I told him I didn't know yet, and that I needed time to decide whether the marriage we had left was worth rebuilding, or whether the truth I had uncovered about his family and about his silence had already answered that question for me. "I keep thinking about the version of me that let this happen," he said one evening, sitting across from me at a coffee shop halfway between our two temporary addresses, neither of us willing yet to call the other's place home. "I keep trying to figure out when I stopped standing up for you, and I can't find one single moment. It wasn't a decision. It was just years of small silences, and I didn't notice how much they'd added up to until it was almost too late." I told him that was, in some ways, the most honest thing he had said to me in years. I told him I understood exactly what he meant, because I had done the same thing from a different angle, absorbing silence after silence, until an entire decade had passed, and I could no longer remember the last time I had spoken plainly to his mother about anything that actually mattered. We sat with that shared recognition for a long time, two people who had each, in their own way, mistaken avoidance for peace. We separated for a period of several months, living apart while I focused on Larkspur, which was, if anything, thriving under the clarity the entire ordeal had given me. I stopped hiding the truth of my ownership from clients and colleagues who had long assumed, thanks to Corine's public narrative, that Julian was the primary force behind the company. I began appearing in industry interviews under my own name, discussing the business I had built, without a single reference to a husband whose family had once tried to write me out of my own story. Those months alone taught me something I hadn't expected. I had assumed, for years, that my identity was inseparable from the roles I performed for other people. Dutiful wife, tolerant daughter-in-law, quietly capable business owner who let her husband take the credit for the sake of family peace. Living alone, answering to no one's expectations but my own, I discovered a version of myself I had nearly forgotten existed, sharper, louder in the privacy of my own thoughts, entirely unwilling to shrink herself back down to fit into a smaller story. I threw myself into Larkspur's fourth location during that period, a project I had been circling for years but had always postponed, telling myself the timing wasn't right, the risk wasn't worth it, the family wouldn't approve of the expansion debt. I realized, somewhere in the middle of signing the lease on the new space, that I had spent years asking a family's permission I never actually needed, for decisions about a company they had no legal claim to whatsoever. The fourth location opened ahead of schedule and became, within its first year, the highest performing office in the company. Corrine, meanwhile, attempted a final campaign of damage control. She reached out to mutual friends, reframing the entire situation as a misunderstanding, insisting that she had never intended to displace me, that the lunch with Simone had been innocent, that the divorce proceedings had been Julian's idea entirely. Nobody who had witnessed the family's behavior over the previous 2 years believed her, and word spread, as it always does in circles like theirs, until Corrine found herself facing the very thing she had once tried to inflict on me. A quiet, social erasure, whispered about at the same luncheons where she had once bragged about her son's business empire. Desmond's health, ironically, did worsen during this period, a minor cardiac episode escalating into something that required a longer hospital stay than the family had first anticipated. I found myself, despite everything, sending flowers to the hospital, because whatever the family had done to me, I had never stopped believing that basic decency should not be conditional on how someone had treated you in the past. I did not visit in person, not yet, but I made sure the flowers arrived with a simple, honest note wishing him a full recovery. Bridget, in a moment I did not expect, called me during that time and offered something close to an apology of her own. She told me she had spent the hours in that hospital waiting room thinking about how quickly everything a family assumes is permanent can be taken away, and that it had forced her to reconsider some of her own behavior over the previous 2 years. She admitted, with more honesty than I had ever heard from her before, that she had enjoyed watching the family target me far more than she should have, that some petty, competitive part of her had relished the idea of me being replaced, and that she was ashamed of that part of herself now that she'd had time to sit with it. I told her I appreciated her honesty, though I made clear I wasn't ready to pretend the previous 2 years hadn't happened simply because she'd had a change of heart during a difficult week. She said she understood and that she wasn't asking for forgiveness, just wanted me to know she saw now what she hadn't let herself see before. It was a small conversation, but it mattered more than I expected it to. A single thread of honesty in a family that had spent so long weaving an elaborate, comfortable fiction instead. Julian and I began speaking again slowly, without lawyers in the room, without his mother's voice shaping every conversation. I want to tell you honestly that I did not make my decision about our marriage out of romantic sentiment. I made it after watching, for months, whether Julian was capable of choosing me over his family's approval when there was nothing left to gain from the choice. No business to fight over, no leverage to protect, just the simple question of who he actually wanted to build a life with. He chose me consistently without prompting, in 100 small ways that mattered more than any grand gesture could have. He stopped attending family dinners that excluded me. He told his mother plainly that any future relationship with him required treating me with respect, not tolerance. He asked, for the first time in 11 years, to actually understand how Larkspur worked, not as a claim to ownership, but as genuine interest in the life I had built. We did not rush back into the marriage we had before. We built something new instead, one grounded in honesty rather than convenient silence. Adaline helped draft the new agreement over several weeks, and this time, Julian insisted on hearing his own independent attorney to review every line before he signed anything, a small but meaningful change from the man who had once signed a 6-year amendment without reading past its summary page. I found something quietly reassuring in watching him take that step seriously, as though he understood, finally, that trust and diligence were not opposites but partners. I asked him to sign a new, updated agreement, one that reflected the reality of our partnership going forward, including a clearer, fairer arrangement for his role in the business, not out of guilt, but out of genuine respect for the work he had actually done over the years, once you separated it from his family's inflated claims about it. The new agreement gave him a defined, meaningful stake in the company's future growth, tied explicitly to his ongoing operational contributions, a structure that felt, to both of us, far more honest than the vague, unexamined assumption of ours we had been living under for the previous decade. If you've ever had to decide whether someone deserved a second chance after watching, in real time, whether they'd choose you when it actually cost them something, you understand exactly what those months meant to me. Like this video, if you believe people can genuinely change when they're finally forced to see the truth clearly. Because what happened at the final family gathering, the one where Isla Ashworth had to face the consequences of everything she'd built on a lie, is coming up next. A year after that Sunday lunch where Isla Ashworth first sat a stranger in my chair, I hosted a dinner in the same house, at the same table. This time, I sent the invitations myself. This time, everyone who walked through my door understood exactly whose home they were standing in. Corrine arrived quieter than I had ever seen her, the confidence that had once filled every room she entered noticeably absent. Desmond, recovering but frail, sat beside her, and for the first time in 11 years, I watched him treat me not as an afterthought but as the host whose hospitality he was genuinely grateful for. Bridget came alone, without the sharp edges she had once carried so casually, and she thanked me quietly before the meal began for not holding the worst of her behavior against her forever. I did not bring up Simone. I never learned and never asked what became of that arrangement once the family's plans collapsed, and honestly, I found I no longer cared. She had been a piece in someone else's plan, much like I once was, and I felt no need to make her part of a story that no longer belonged to Corrine to write. Over dinner, I did something I had never done in 11 years of sitting at that table. I talked, openly and without apology, about Larkspur Design Studio, about the $11 million valuation, about the 4th location we had just opened, about the years of work that had built it from nothing while this family assumed it belonged to someone else entirely. Corrine listened in a silence I had once mistaken, years earlier, for disapproval. I understood now that it was something closer to reckoning. Before dessert, Corrine asked to speak with me privately. We stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had once quietly set down a serving dish, rather than say the things I actually felt. She told me, in words that clearly cost her something to say, that she had spent 2 years believing she understood exactly what our family's future required, and that she had never once considered that the woman she dismissed as replaceable might be the very foundation everything else depended on. I told her I appreciated the honesty, though it had come a year and a great deal of damage too late to undo everything it had cost. I told her that I had chosen to stay in this marriage, to rebuild something with her son, not because the family deserved a second chance, but because Julian had finally earned one through 100 choices she had no part in shaping. I told her that going forward, my place at this table and my ownership of everything I had built would never again be something she was permitted to plan around without my knowledge. She nodded, and for the first time in 11 years, I watched Isla Ashworth look at me the way you look at someone you finally, fully see. Not the quiet wife she had once assumed she could quietly discard. Not a name attached conveniently to her son's business. A woman who had built an empire with her own 2 hands while an entire family looked past her, confident in an assumption they had never once bothered to verify. We finished dinner that night without further incident, and though I won't pretend every wound from those 2 years has fully healed, I can tell you honestly that I no longer sit at that table waiting to be underestimated. I sit at the head of it, exactly where I always belonged, in a house, a marriage, and a business that are, and have always been, entirely my own. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from no longer needing anyone else's permission to occupy the space you have already earned. I did not fully understand that peace until it arrived, quietly, sometime in the months after that final family dinner, when I realized I had stopped bracing myself every time Kareen's name appeared on my phone, stopped rehearsing defenses before family gatherings, stopped shrinking my own accomplishments in conversation to make other people comfortable with how much I had built. Larkspur opened its fifth location that following spring, this time in a city 2 states away, a genuine expansion beyond anything I had imagined possible back in that cramped studio above the hardware store. The lease alone represented a larger financial commitment than the entire company had been worth in its first 3 years combined, and signing it required a kind of confidence I don't think I would have had access to before everything with the Ashworth family forced me to fully claim what I had built. I flew out for the opening alone, stood in the empty space the night before the ribbon cutting, and allowed myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to simply feel proud without immediately looking around to see whether anyone else in the room recognized what I had done. I walked through the empty rooms, still smelling of fresh paint and sawdust, and thought about the drafting table I had refinished myself in that first studio, about how far a single sketchbook full of half-formed ideas had actually traveled in the years since. I thought, too, about Kareen, not with anger this time, but with something closer to distance, the particular clarity that comes once a wound has finally scarred over enough to stop dictating your emotions in real time. I understood, finally, that her cruelty had never actually been about me specifically. It had been about her own narrow understanding of what women like me were supposed to be allowed to become, an understanding I had spent 11 years quietly, patiently, thoroughly proving wrong. Julian came to the opening the following day, not as a co-owner, not performing a role his family had once assigned him, but as my husband, standing quietly at the back of the room, applauding along with everyone else when I cut the ribbon. Afterward, he told me it was the first time he had truly understood, in his body and not just his mind, exactly what I had built while his family spent years dismissing it as a hobby I would eventually outgrow. I think sometimes about the version of myself who set that serving dish down without a word, who smiled thinly at Kareen's cruelty and asked if anyone wanted coffee. I don't judge her the way I once might have. She was surviving the only way she knew how, in a family that had spent over a decade teaching her that her silence was the price of belonging. I am grateful to her in a strange way, because her patience, however costly, gave me the time I needed to quietly build the foundation that would eventually hold everything up. But I am also grateful I finally stopped being her. I am grateful for the moment I chose to stop absorbing other people's cruelty as though it were simply the weather, and started treating the truth as the weapon it had always had the potential to be. Nobody handed me that shift. I had to find it myself, in a dark office at midnight, holding a folder full of documents that had been quietly protecting me the entire time, waiting patiently for the day I would finally need them. Standing in that empty fifth location the night before its opening, I called Odette, the friend who had once told me that some people would never see what I'd built unless I made them look directly at it. I told her she'd been right, and I thanked her for the push I hadn't been ready to hear at the time. She laughed and told me she'd known, even back then, that I'd get here eventually, that some people simply need the right amount of time and the right amount of provocation before they stop hiding what they've earned. I think about that Sunday afternoon often, the serving dish in my hands, Simone sitting in my chair, Kareen's bright, deliberate cruelty dressed up as small talk. I think about how close I came to believing in that moment that I truly had lost everything, the way they wanted me to believe. And I think about how the truth, quiet and patient and entirely mine, was waiting the whole time to prove them catastrophically wrong. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been counted out by people who never bothered to check what you were actually capable of, I'd love to hear your story. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and tell me the moment you finally proved someone wrong about who you really were. If you haven't already, subscribe now, because there are more stories like this one coming, and hit that like button before you go, because it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear exactly this kind of story tonight. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I'll see you in the next one.